Imagine sitting in a cockpit traveling faster than the speed of sound, pulling 9 times the force of gravity, your body pressed so hard into your seat that your vision narrows to a tunnel, your lungs struggle to draw breath, and the only thing standing between you and death is your training, your instinct, and your nerve. Now imagine doing all of that while the entire institution around you is telling you that you do not belong there, that you are too weak, too emotional, too small, too female. That is not a hypothetical scenario. That is the reality that a generation of American women walked into when they dared to climb inside a fighter jet and demand their place in the sky. This is not a story about women being given an opportunity. This is a story about women who seized something that was never supposed to be theirs, who fought in courtrooms, in Congress, in locker rooms, and in the cockpit, who flew through walls that the military had spent decades reinforcing with law, tradition, pride, and prejudice, and who, despite everything working against them, broke through. Today we are going to spend the next hour inside one of the most extraordinary civil rights battles in American military history. Battle that did not happen on the streets or in the halls of government alone, but 30,000 feet above the earth, at supersonic speeds, in the most unforgiving environment that any human being can occupy. We are going to meet the women who made history. We are going to understand the forces that tried to stop them, and we are going to discover what it truly cost to open the American fighter cockpit to women for the very first time, because this story is not just about aviation. It is not just about the military. It is about what happens when a system built by men, for men, over generations of tradition and institutional power, is finally confronted by women who are simply too talented, too determined, and too courageous to be turned away. Let us go back. Let us go all the way back to the beginning, to a time when American women were already flying, already proving themselves in the air, and still being told it was not enough. The year is 1942. The United States has just entered the Second World War following the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Army Air Forces are desperate for pilots. Thousands of male pilots are needed at the front, which means the pilots who have been ferrying aircraft across the country, testing new planes, and performing non-combat support missions need to be freed up for combat, and someone has to do those support jobs. That is where a remarkable woman named Jacqueline Cochran steps forward with an idea that will change American aviation history. Cochran, already one of the most celebrated female pilots in the world, a woman who had set more speed and altitude records than almost anyone alive, proposed a simple and radical idea: train women pilots to perform the support and ferry missions that were consuming thousands of male pilots who were needed in combat theaters. The Army resisted. The idea of women in military aircraft was deeply unsettling to the institutional culture of the Army Air Forces, but the math was undeniable. The country needed pilots. Women could fly. The logic was unbreakable, and so the Women Air Force Service Pilots Program was born, the WASPs. 38 women would die flying for that program before the war was over. They flew every single aircraft in the Army Air Force's inventory. They towed aerial targets so that male gunners could practice shooting at moving targets from the ground, from ships, and from other aircraft. Let that sink in for a moment. They flew aircraft towing targets so that men could practice shooting at them. They flew flying fortresses. They flew B-29 Superfortresses, the most advanced and demanding bomber of the entire war, at a time when male pilots were refusing to fly the aircraft because it was considered too dangerous, too difficult, too temperamental. Women flew it anyway. They flew pursuit aircraft, the fast single-engine fighters that required extraordinary skill and physical conditioning. They ferried P-38 Lightnings, P-47 Thunderbolts, and P-51 Mustangs across the country into departure points for overseas shipment. They proved beyond any reasonable argument that women could handle high-performance military aircraft. They proved it with their lives when necessary, and then the war ended, and the program was shut down, and the women were sent home, without veteran status, without benefits, without recognition. It would take until 1977 for Congress to finally grant WASP veterans the military recognition they had earned 3 decades earlier. But even as the WASPs were disbanded, the seed had been planted. The question had been answered. Women could fly military aircraft. The only question remaining was whether the institution would ever allow them to do it again in a meaningful way. For the next 3 decades, that answer was a resounding no. The Cold War-era military was not merely resistant to female pilots. It was, by law and by culture, completely closed to them in any meaningful aviation role. Women who joined the military in the post-war years found themselves restricted to administrative, medical, and support functions. The idea of a woman in a cockpit, particularly a combat cockpit, was not just discouraged. It was forbidden explicitly, in writing, by federal law and military regulation. But the world was changing. The 1960s brought a civil rights revolution that shook every institution in American life. The 1970s brought the women's liberation movement to a full boil, and in 1972, Congress passed the Equal Rights Amendment and sent it to the states for ratification. The military was not immune to these forces, even if it tried desperately to resist them. The military branches began, reluctantly and minimally, to open some aviation roles to women. The Navy created its first female naval aviator program in 1974. The Army had been allowing women to fly helicopters in limited capacities. But the crown jewel, the thing that every young pilot who had grown up dreaming of Top Gun, of afterburners, of air combat maneuvering truly wanted, the fighter jet, remained completely off-limits, not just to women. Off-limits to women by an explicit legal statute called the Combat Exclusion Laws, which prohibited women from serving in combat roles. And fighters, by their very definition, were combat aircraft. The argument seemed airtight. It was not discrimination, the military argued. It was law, it was policy. It was the recognition that war was a male domain and that placing women in harm's way was something the American public and the American military would never accept. What the people making that argument failed to anticipate was that the American women who had already spent years flying military aircraft, instructing, ferrying, and testing were not going to accept it either. The 1970s brought the first cracks in the wall. In 1976, the service academies were open to women for the first time. The United States Military Academy at West Point, the Naval Academy at Annapolis, the Air Force Academy at Colorado Springs, all admitted their first female cadets. It was a historic moment and also an intensely hostile one. The women who entered those institutions in 1976 walked into environments that were, in many cases, openly contemptuous of their presence. They were hazed, humiliated, excluded, and demeaned in ways that went far beyond the normal rigors of military education. They were told constantly, in words and in actions, that they did not belong, and they stayed anyway. They graduated. They earned their commissions. And some of them, with fire in their eyes, began looking at the sky and asking the question that the institution most feared. Why not fighters? Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, women in military aviation were making steady if painful progress. Female pilots were flying transports, tankers, reconnaissance aircraft, and helicopters in various branches. They were demonstrating technical proficiency, physical capability, and professional discipline at every turn. The arguments against them were evaporating one by one in the face of the actual evidence. But the fighter community held firm. The culture of the fighter community, the swagger, the brotherhood, the deeply masculine identity that had been built up over generations of war, regarded the very suggestion of a female fighter pilot as something between an absurdity and an insult. The fighter pilot identity was not merely professional. It was cultural. It was mythological. It was built on the idea that combat flying required a particular kind of courage, aggression, and physical and psychological toughness that was inherently masculine. The fighter pilot was the warrior distilled to his purest form, the knight of the modern age, the samurai of the sky, and in that mythology, there was simply no room for a woman. This was not just casual prejudice. It was an institutional belief system reinforced at every level. In the officers' clubs where fighter pilots gathered after missions. In the flight briefing rooms where combat tactics were discussed. In the squadron culture that shaped every young aviator who wanted to fly fast jets. The message was consistent and unmistakable. This is not your world, but the legal landscape was shifting. And in 1991, everything changed. The Persian Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm, had just concluded. American women had served in that conflict in unprecedented numbers, closer to combat than ever before in American history. Female soldiers and aviators had performed support missions in a combat theater. Some had been taken prisoner, some had died. The arguments about protecting women from the dangers of war had been dramatically undermined by the reality of what had just happened. War did not politely restrict itself to areas where women were allowed to be. War went everywhere, and women were there. In the wake of Desert Storm, a presidential commission was convened to examine the combat exclusion laws and the role of women in the military. The debate was fierce. The testimony was extraordinary. Women who had flown in the Gulf War sat before committees and explained in precise, technical, professional terms exactly what they had done and what they were capable of doing. Critics argued passionately that unit cohesion, physical standards, and the nature of combat made the inclusion of women in fighter aviation a dangerous mistake. Supporters argued with equal passion that the evidence showed women were fully capable and that the exclusion was simple discrimination dressed up in the language of military necessity. The commission was divided. The debate was unresolved, but something was happening in Washington that would cut right through the noise. In November 1991, Congress repealed the combat exclusion laws for aviation. The legal barrier was gone. Women could now fly combat aircraft now, right now, by law. The Air Force, the Navy, the Marine Corps, and the Army all had to figure out what to do next. And the answer was not as simple as opening a door and welcoming women in. The institutional culture of the fighter community had not changed because a law changed. The attitudes, the traditions, the social dynamics, the informal networks of power and exclusion that had kept women out for generations, none of that disappeared overnight. What disappeared was the legal excuse. What came next was a test of institutional will, and what happened in 1993 would write a chapter that will never be forgotten. The Air Force announced that it would open combat aviation positions to women, and on October 22, 1993, First Lieutenant Jeannie Leavitt became the first woman to qualify as a United States Air Force fighter pilot. She flew the F-15E Strike Eagle, one of the most powerful and capable aircraft in the world, a twin-engine, supersonic, all-weather, multi-role strike fighter. She had earned her place in the cockpit not through political pressure or public relations, but through the same grinding, demanding, unforgiving process that every fighter pilot before her had gone through. She had outflown, outstudied, outperformed, and out-endured the process. And the Air Force, whatever its internal culture said about her, had to acknowledge it. She was a fighter pilot, she wore the wings, she had the qualification, she had earned it. But earning the qualification and being accepted were two very different things. The next decade of female fighter pilot history is not simply a story of triumph. It is a story of what happens when legal change runs headlong into cultural resistance, of what women endured inside the squadrons where they served, of the subtle and not so subtle ways that an institution can comply with the letter of a law while violating its spirit at every turn. Female fighter pilots in the 1990s found themselves navigating environments that were, in many cases, profoundly hostile. The locker room culture of the fighter community was not sanitized by the arrival of women. Squadron traditions that were deeply sexist, that had been built up over decades and were considered sacred by the men who practiced them, did not disappear. Women who objected were told they were being oversensitive. Women who stayed silent were trying to survive. Either way, they were navigating a minefield that their male colleagues never had to acknowledge, let alone traverse. And then came tailhook. The tailhook scandal of 1991, where Navy and Marine Corps aviators at the annual Tailhook Association convention in Las Vegas sexually assaulted dozens of women, including female naval officers, sent shockwaves through the entire military aviation community. It was not just a Navy problem. It was a symptom of a culture that had allowed the most extreme expressions of hypermasculine fighter pilot identity to go completely unchecked. The scandal resulted in the investigation of hundreds of officers, the forced retirement of admirals, and a reckoning with the culture of naval aviation that was long overdue. But reckonings take time. And for the women who were trying to build careers in military fighter aviation in the years after Tailhook, the culture did not transform overnight. It evolved slowly, painfully, with enormous resistance from those who wanted to preserve what they had always known. During this same period, another battle was being fought: the physical and physiological argument against female fighter pilots. Critics had long maintained that the physical demands of high-performance flight, specifically the G-forces that a pilot experiences during aggressive maneuvering, were simply incompatible with the female physiology. The argument was that women could not tolerate high-G environments as well as men, that they were more susceptible to G-induced loss of consciousness, known as GLOC, and that this made them inherently less capable and more dangerous in a combat environment. The Air Force conducted rigorous physiological research to address these claims, and the results were complicated. Women, on average, do have some physiological differences that affect G tolerance. But the research also showed that individual variation within both sexes was far greater than the average difference between sexes. That properly trained, physically conditioned, and equipped female pilots could perform at the same level as their male counterparts in high-G environments. That the proper use of the anti-G straining maneuver, the physical technique pilots used to resist the effects of high G-forces, and properly fitted G-suits could compensate for any average physiological disadvantage. The argument was not that women and men were physically identical. The argument was that the difference did not matter in practice when individual selection standards were properly applied. A female pilot who could meet the same performance standards as a male pilot was by definition qualified, and some women not only met those standards, they exceeded them. But the physiological argument was replaced by another one: the seat argument. For years, the cockpits of many fighter aircraft were literally not designed to accommodate the physical dimensions of many women. Seats, controls, and instrument placements that had been engineered around the average male body created environments where shorter pilots, including many but not all women, found certain cockpit tasks more physically demanding. Ejection seat systems designed for pilots within a specific weight and height range raised safety concerns for pilots outside those parameters. These were real engineering challenges, but the way the military approached them told a story of its own. When the issue was acknowledged as a design problem, it could be addressed through engineering. When it was framed as a female problem, it became a justification for exclusion. The history of how those conversations happened inside the military establishment in the 1990s and 2000s is a case study in how institutional bias operates through the language of technical concern. The engineers who were asked to study cockpit accommodation for female pilots found that modifications were possible. That seats could be redesigned, that control configurations could be adjusted, that the barrier was not physics or biology but investment and will. When the will existed, the barriers fell. When the will did not exist, the barriers remained, and women paid the price. Through all of this, the women kept flying. They flew operational missions. They deployed to combat theaters. They flew in Bosnia. They flew in Kosovo. They flew patrols over Iraq in the no-fly zone enforcement operations that continued for years after Desert Storm. They were not flying in some separate protected women's aviation category. They were flying the same missions, in the same aircraft, against the same threats as their male colleagues. And the sky did not fall. Lieutenant Colonel Martha McSally is a name that deserves to be spoken at length in this story. A graduate of the Air Force Academy in the class of 1988, McSally became the first woman to fly in combat for the United States Air Force when she flew A-10 Thunderbolt II missions over Iraq in 1991 during Operation Desert Storm, though the legal debates about that specific designation are complicated by the timing of the combat exclusion law's repeal. What is unambiguous is that McSally became the first woman to fly a combat mission in the direct support of ground forces when she flew at 10 missions during the enforcement of the Iraqi no-fly zones in the late 1990s. But McSally's story is not only about what she accomplished in the cockpit. It is also about what she fought outside of it. When McSally was stationed in Saudi Arabia, as part of the forces enforcing the no-fly zone over Iraq, she was subjected to military policies that required female American service members to wear the abaya, the traditional head-to-toe covering worn by Saudi women, when traveling off-base in Saudi Arabia. American female officers were also required to ride in the back seat of vehicles and be accompanied by male escorts when traveling off-base, in deference to Saudi cultural norms. McSally refused, and then she sued. She filed a lawsuit arguing that these policies violated the constitutional rights of female service members by imposing religious and cultural dress requirements based on sex. The case went to federal court. McSally argued, and a judge ultimately agreed, that the military policies were unconstitutional. Congress subsequently passed legislation prohibiting the military from requiring female service members to wear the abaya. Think about what that meant. A woman who was risking her life flying combat aircraft over hostile territory was also fighting a legal battle for her right to wear her uniform when she left the base. The same institution that was sending her into combat was requiring her to put on the clothing of a religious culture that did not allow women to drive when she stepped off the flight line in Saudi Arabia. The contradictions of her position were not subtle, they were enormous. And she fought them with the same precision and aggression that she brought to every mission she flew. McSally would go on to command a fighter squadron, the first woman to do so in Air Force history, and eventually to serve as a United States Senator. But it is the pilot and the fighter, the woman who fought the Air Force and the courts and the culture of both Saudi Arabia and her own military simultaneously, who belongs in this story today. By the time the United States entered the global war on terror following the September 11 attacks in 2001, female fighter pilots were no longer a novelty. They were a reality. They were flying combat missions over Afghanistan and Iraq. They were part of the force structure. They were in the squadrons. The culture was not healed. The resistance was not gone. But the ground had shifted dramatically from where it had stood a decade earlier. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq brought their own set of challenges and revelations for women in military aviation. The nature of counterinsurgency warfare, where the battlefield had no clear front line, and where support aircraft were operating in close proximity to ground forces in complex, fluid environments, created situations where the theoretical distinction between combat and non-combat roles became essentially meaningless. Female pilots were flying close air support missions, providing direct fire support to ground troops in contact with the enemy. They were dropping bombs. They were firing missiles and cannon rounds in direct support of American soldiers and Marines who were fighting for their lives on the ground below. The legal framework had changed. The cultural reality was still catching up. But in the air, over the deserts and mountains of the Middle East, the question of whether a woman could fly a fighter aircraft in combat had been answered definitively and repeatedly, and was now simply a matter of fact. It is worth stopping here in the middle of this story to talk about what it actually takes to become a fighter pilot. Because the public narrative often focuses on the political and social dimensions of women in fighter aviation without fully conveying the sheer, staggering difficulty of what these women accomplished purely on a professional level. To become a fighter pilot in the United States Air Force, a candidate must first complete a 4-year degree, typically from a service academy or ROTC program. They must pass the Air Force Officer Qualifying Test and the Aviation Selection Test Battery. They must pass a rigorous physical examination. They must be selected from a highly competitive pool of candidates for undergraduate pilot training, a year-long program that is physically and academically brutal, and from which a significant percentage of candidates wash out or are eliminated. Those who complete undergraduate pilot training earn their wings and are then assigned to an aircraft, and the most competitive students are assigned to fighters. Then begins formal fighter training, the aircraft-specific program that teaches the foundational skills of fighter aviation. This is followed by assignment to an operational squadron, where a new pilot designated a wingman spends years building the experience and proficiency to eventually qualify as a flight lead, then as an instructor pilot, and then, for the best of the best, perhaps selection to attend the Fighter Weapons School at Nellis Air Force Base, the institution that the movie Top Gun was very loosely based upon. Every single step of that process is designed to eliminate anyone who cannot perform at the highest level. The standards are not polite, the evaluation system does not give credit for effort, the instructors do not celebrate mediocrity. And yet, through all of it, women made it, not a handful, not barely. Some of them excelled to a degree that no one who had argued against their inclusion could dismiss or explain away. Major Nicole Malachowski is one of those names. Malachowski became the first female pilot selected to fly with the United States Air Force Thunderbirds, the precision aerial demonstration team that represents the absolute pinnacle of flying skill within the Air Force community. The Thunderbirds fly in formation at distances measured in feet, at airspeeds approaching the speed of sound, performing maneuvers that demand a level of precision, coordination, and sheer flying ability that is matched by almost no one in the world. Selection to the Thunderbirds is intensely competitive and is considered among the highest honors available to an Air Force pilot. Malachowski was not selected because she was a woman. She was selected because she was one of the best pilots in the Air Force. The Thunderbirds did not need a female pilot for public relations purposes. They needed a pilot who could fly at their level. Malachowski could, and she did. For 2 years, she flew the number 3 position, flying the left wing in the diamond formation, one of the most demanding positions in the entire show sequence. When she flew at air shows across the country, tens of thousands of people watched. Many of them were young girls who had never imagined that the pilot in that sleek red, white, and blue F-16 could look like them. The impact of visible representation on the aspirations of the next generation is difficult to quantify but impossible to dismiss. Those girls grew up, and some of them became pilots. The story of women in the fighter cockpit is also inevitably a story of loss, because fighter aviation is a profession that demands everything from those who practice it, and sometimes it takes everything in return. Female fighter pilots have paid the same cost that the profession has always demanded of those who fly at the edge of human performance and the limits of technology. Captain Kim Campbell is a name that belongs in this story. In April 2003, during Operation Iraqi Freedom, Campbell was flying her Thunderbolt II over Baghdad when her aircraft was hit by enemy ground fire. The damage was catastrophic. Hydraulic systems failed. Flight controls were severely compromised. The A-10, known for its legendary toughness and its ability to absorb punishment that would destroy any other aircraft, was barely flying. Campbell, faced with a crippled aircraft over a hostile city, made a decision that saved her life and saved the aircraft. She switched to manual reversion, a backup control mode that uses mechanical linkages instead of hydraulic systems, making the aircraft extremely difficult to control, especially for a damaged plane. She flew her crippled A-10 back to her base and landed it safely. The aircraft, when examined afterward, was found to have sustained hundreds of hits from enemy fire. The damage was so severe that the aircraft was initially written off as destroyed. Campbell was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for her actions. She did not land that aircraft safely because she was a woman or in spite of being a woman. She landed it safely because she was an extraordinarily skilled and courageous pilot who had been trained to handle the worst possible situations, and who, when the worst possible situation arrived, performed exactly as her training had prepared her to do. That is the story of women in the fighter cockpit at its core. Not a story of political milestones, though those milestones matter enormously. Not a story of gender politics, though the gender politics are real and consequential. It is, at its foundation, a story of professionalism, of skill, of courage, of men and women together flying the most demanding machines ever built, doing the most dangerous work that a democracy ever asks of its citizens, and discovering that the only thing that matters in the cockpit is whether you can fly. As the 2000s progressed and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq continued, the remaining formal barriers to women in combat roles began to collapse under the weight of reality. Women were already in the fight. The question of whether they could handle it had been answered thousands of times over thousands of missions. The argument was no longer whether women belonged in combat aviation. It was why the remaining restrictions in ground combat roles had not yet been removed. In 2013, Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs General Martin Dempsey officially rescinded the policy that had excluded women from direct ground combat roles. It was the largest formal expansion of women's roles in the history of the United States military, and it was in significant part made possible by the 2 decades of evidence that female pilots, including fighter pilots, had accumulated since the combat exclusion laws were repealed in 1991. The fighter pilots had gone first. They had proven the concept. They had borne the cost of being pioneers in an environment that was deeply resistant to their presence. And in doing so, they had made it possible for every subsequent step toward full integration to be argued from a foundation of evidence rather than theory. The Air Force's Fighter Weapons School, the institution at Nellis Air Force Base that trains the most elite combat aviators in the world, and then sends them back to their units as weapons officers and instructors who shape the entire fighter force, graduated its first female student in the modern era of integration. The F-35 program, the fifth-generation stealth fighter that represents the leading edge of American air power, has female pilots who are fully qualified and operationally assigned. Female pilots have been selected for test pilot schools where the most experimental and cutting-edge aircraft in the inventory are put through their paces. They are everywhere in military aviation now, not in large numbers, not in numbers that reflect their proportion of the general population, but everywhere. General Lori Robinson became the first woman to command a numbered air force, then became the first woman to command a combatant command when she was appointed commander of United States Northern Command and North American Aerospace Defense Command in 2016, placing her in charge of the air defense of the entire North American continent. She was, in that role, responsible for every fighter aircraft, every missile defense system, and every radar installation that protects the United States and Canada from aerial attack. The first woman to hold that responsibility, the first woman to stand in that chain of command. Jeannie Leavitt, who had been the first female fighter pilot to qualify in 1993, went on to command a fighter wing, to serve in senior Air Force leadership positions, and to retire as a brigadier general. The woman who had walked through a door that had never been opened before eventually helped build the institution that the next generation of female fighter pilots would enter. The story did not end with any single milestone. It did not end with the repeal of the combat exclusion laws. It did not end with Jeannie Leavitt's wings. It did not end with Kim Campbell's Distinguished Flying Cross or Nicole Malachowski's Thunderbird slot or Martha McSally's command or Lori Robinson's combatant command. It is still being written. Every day in squadrons around the world, female fighter pilots are flying missions, building experience, advancing in their careers, and doing the same work that their male colleagues are doing in the same aircraft, on the same missions, in the same sky. The numbers are still small. Women represent a tiny fraction of the fighter pilot community. The culture, while dramatically different from what it was in 1993, has not been transformed completely. The dynamics of gender in a heavily male-dominated professional environment are not resolved by the passage of a law or the accumulation of milestones. They are resolved, slowly and imperfectly, by the daily reality of service, by the building of trust, by the slow erosion of stereotypes in the face of evidence, and by the gradual change in who sees themselves in the cockpit. The pipeline problem is real. To have more female fighter pilots, you need more women who want to be fighter pilots, who believe that it is possible, who see themselves in that role, and who pursue it from the earliest stages of their education and training. To have more women who believe it is possible, you need visible examples. To have visible examples, you need women in the pipeline. The cycle is slow, but it is moving. The culture of recruitment has changed. The Air Force, the Navy, and the Marine Corps all actively recruit female pilots in ways that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. Scholarship programs, mentorship networks, and the visible presence of senior female aviators at recruiting events and in public-facing roles all contribute to building the pipeline that will eventually change the demographics of the fighter community. The technology is changing too. The fifth-generation fighter aircraft, the F-22 Raptor and the F-35 Lightning II, were designed with cockpit ergonomics that accommodate a broader range of pilot body types than the legacy aircraft they replaced. The ejection systems in these aircraft have been engineered to function safely across a wider range of pilot weights. The physical arguments against female pilots that were partly grounded in genuine engineering limitations of older aircraft are less applicable to the newest generation of fighters. Artificial intelligence and autonomy are beginning to change what fighter aviation will look like in the future. The aircraft of the next generation will fly alongside autonomous wingmen, unmanned combat aircraft that are controlled by human pilots in manned platforms. The physical demands of flight, already managed by technology, will be further moderated as automation handles more of the workload. The fighter pilot of the future will still need to be courageous, analytically sharp, tactically brilliant, and physically capable. But the nature of the physical requirements will continue to evolve. None of this diminishes what the women of the past 3 decades accomplished. If anything, it amplifies it. They fought for inclusion in a world that was defined by its physical and cultural demands. They met those demands. They did not ask for a modified version of the profession. They asked for the real thing on the same terms as everyone else, and they got it, and they handled it. Let us talk for a moment about what we lose as a society when we exclude talented people from roles they are capable of performing. When the fighter community was closed to women, the Air Force did not just lose the women who would have been good fighter pilots. It lost the women who would have been great ones. The women who, under different circumstances, might have been among the best combat aviators who ever lived. We will never know their names because they never got the chance to prove what they could do. The talent that was excluded, the potential that was never developed, the excellence that was never expressed, all of that is a cost that cannot be calculated but is absolutely real. The integration of women into the fighter community did not weaken it. The evidence, which is now 30 years old, is unambiguous on this point. The Air Force's fighter force is not less capable because women are part of it. It is not less cohesive. It is not less lethal. The dire predictions of those who opposed integration have not been borne out. The fighter community has continued to produce some of the most effective combat aviation in the history of warfare. And women have been part of that production. What the integration did do was change the culture. Slowly, imperfectly, but meaningfully. The fighter community of today is different from the fighter community of 1991 in ways that go beyond the simple presence of women in the squadrons. The culture is somewhat more professional, somewhat less tolerant of the most extreme behaviors that characterized an earlier era, somewhat more focused on the actual business of flying and fighting, and somewhat less devoted to the rituals of masculine performance that surrounded that business. That is not entirely attributable to the integration of women. Time, leadership, institutional reform, and the sober lessons of sustained combat operations in multiple theaters have all contributed. But the presence of women, the simple fact of their daily participation in the full range of professional activities that a fighter squadron performs, has been part of that cultural evolution. As we approach the conclusion of this story, it is worth returning to where we started, to the question of what it means to sit in that cockpit, to understand the gravity of what the women in this story chose and fought for and achieved. Flying a fighter aircraft is not glamorous in the way that movies suggest. The training is grinding and relentless. The workload in the cockpit is overwhelming. The physical demands are severe. The margin for error is essentially zero. The consequences of mistakes are often fatal. A fighter pilot works harder than almost anyone in any other profession, harder than the work is visible to the outside world. The public sees the aircraft at air shows, hears the sonic boom, watches the vapor trails against the blue sky. The pilots see the pre-dawn briefings, the endless study of tactics and systems, the exhausting post-mission debriefs where every decision is picked apart and every mistake is analyzed in clinical detail. The women who pursued this calling did not do it because it was easy. They did not do it because the institution welcomed them. They did it because they were born to fly, because there was something in them that recognized the sky as home, that understood the relationship between human consciousness and high-performance aviation as a form of expression that nothing else could replace. They did it because they were, at the level of pure capability and passion, fighter pilots. And because being a fighter pilot required them to fight on two fronts at once, against the enemy in the air and against the enemy of institutional prejudice on the ground, they became something even more remarkable than simply great pilots. They became pioneers. They became the proof. They became the reason the door stayed open for everyone who came after them. The arc of this story is still being traced. The fighter community is not fully integrated in the way that its numbers would suggest is appropriate for a military that draws from the entire population of the United States. The cultural work is not finished. The pipeline is not full. The mentorship networks are still being built. The attitudes in some squadrons are still not what they should be. This is a story in progress, but the progress is undeniable. From the WASPs of the Second World War, who flew every aircraft in the inventory and were sent home without recognition, to Jeannie Leavitt breaking the sound barrier and the gender barrier in the same aircraft in 1993, to Kim Campbell flying her shattered A-10 home over Baghdad in 2003, to Nicole Malachowski rolling inverted at 500 miles an hour in the Thunderbird's diamond formation, to General Laurie Robinson standing watch over the air defense of a continent. The line runs clear and the direction is unmistakable. The sky was never theirs to give. It was hers to take, and she took it. Now the question I want to leave with you today, the question that I genuinely want you to think about is this. Given everything that these women overcame, given the institutional barriers, the cultural resistance, the legal obstacles, the physiological debates, the social hostility, given all of it, and given the 30 years of evidence that their presence has made the fighter community more capable, not less, why do you think it took so long? And more importantly, what does that delay cost us, not just in aviation, not just in the military, but in every field, every institution, every domain where talent is turned away because of who the person carrying it happens to be? Think about that. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to go deeper into the stories of individual women in this history, if you want to understand the full technical and cultural world of military aviation, if you want to follow the ongoing story of women in the armed forces of the United States, then subscribe, because we are just getting started. The sky has no ceiling, and neither do the people with the courage to fly it.